While millions flocked to theaters seeking escape from global tensions, a disturbing undercurrent flowed through Hollywood itself. Declassified FBI files reveal that federal agents maintained active surveillance on 37% of major studio figures during the war years, tracking suspected Nazi sympathies with varying degrees of evidence. These beloved stars crafted America's cultural identity on screen, while some harbored controversial affiliations behind the scenes. But where does documented history end and wartime paranoia begin? Newly accessible German archives suggest certain Hollywood rumors contained kernels of truth, while others represent nothing more than the weaponization of suspicion against personal and political enemies. Errol Flynn, Hollywood's greatest swashbuckler, faced persistent allegations of Nazi sympathies that extended far beyond his romantic image to suggest active intelligence work for the Third Reich. The accusations painted Flynn not merely as a political sympathizer, but potentially as an actual Abwehr agent operating in American entertainment circles. Intelligence Service records show Flynn was the subject of a confidential FBI investigation beginning in 1941, when his contacts with German-American Bund members at California social events triggered surveillance. Agent reports documented Flynn making statements critical of British colonial policies while expressing admiration for Germany's national revitalization at multiple Hollywood gatherings where known Nazi sympathizers were present. The most serious allegations came from biographer Charles Hyam, who claimed to discover evidence that Flynn served as an Abwehr agent with the codename 15, tasked with gathering information on shipping movements and reporting on high-level conversations at Hollywood gatherings frequented by politically connected figures. Flynn's established 1937 trip to Spain during its Civil War became particularly suspicious when photographs emerged showing him meeting with pro-Franco-German officers. Little did Hollywood know that naval intelligence officers had intercepted correspondence between Flynn and German contacts as early as 1939. Declassified reports note that while Flynn never appeared to provide truly valuable intelligence, his consistent pattern of information gathering at social events attended by military officials raises significant counterintelligence concerns, according to a 1942 assessment. Records later proved that while Flynn maintained troubling associations, definitive evidence of active espionage remains elusive. His family has vigorously contested Hyam's claims, producing documents suggesting selective editing of sources. The enduring debate over Flynn's true allegiances reflects the challenge of separating genuine historical concern from the sensationalism that often surrounds controversial Hollywood figures. Lennie Reefenstall, the pioneering female director whose technical brilliance remained inseparable from her role as Hitler's most effective propagandist, experienced a complex Hollywood reception that evolved from initial professional curiosity to permanent industry blacklisting. Her brief American acceptance and subsequent rejection reflects Hollywood's evolving response to Nazism itself. Studio visitor logs confirm Riefenstahl's extensive 1938 Hollywood tour included meetings with executives at MGM, Paramount, and Disney, with trade publications documenting industry interest in her innovative filming techniques. Academy records verify her invitation to that year's Oscar ceremony, where contemporary accounts describe her receiving polite professional curiosity from the assembled industry elite, despite Germany's already evident persecution of Jews. The disturbing contrast between Riefenstahl's artistic recognition and her propaganda work came into sharpest focus when she attended a dinner hosted by Walt Disney. Attendee correspondence describes Disney praising her cinematography in Triumph of the Will, while apparently separating her technical achievements from their political context. This compartmentalization characterized much of Hollywood's initial response to her work. Witnesses recalled Riefenstahl's defensive posture when questioned about Nazi politics during her Hollywood visit. Screenwriter Bud Schulberg reported that when asked about persecution of Jews, she responded, "One must separate politics from art. I am purely an artist concerned with capturing beauty and power." This attempt to divorce aesthetics from ethics exemplified her lifelong defense against accountability for her role in Nazi propaganda. The industry's initial receptiveness to Riefenstahl transformed rapidly after Kristallnacht in November 1938, when her previous Hollywood contacts became unreachable. Studio correspondence from early 1939 shows executives who had eagerly met with her now instructing staff that no communication with Riefenstahl will be acknowledged or returned, marking one of Hollywood's first explicit rejections of Nazi-affiliated figures. Fritz Mandl and Hedy Lamarr, the Austrian munitions manufacturer who supplied the Nazi war machine before their formal rise to power, created one of Hollywood's most fascinating backstories when his wife, Hedy Lamarr, fled both their marriage and Europe to become a star while harboring technical knowledge that would ultimately assist the Allied war effort against her ex-husband's clients. Military procurement records document Mandl's Hirtenberger Patronenfabrik as a significant armaments supplier to German interests in the early 1930s, with transaction ledgers showing escalating sales volume coinciding with Hitler's ascension. Intelligence reports described Mandl as essential to German rearmament efforts while circumventing Versailles Treaty limitations, making him a pivotal figure in the covert military buildup preceding the war. The stark contrast between Mandl's Nazi business dealings and Lamarr's eventual contribution to Allied technology represents one of Hollywood's most dramatic personal connections to the European conflict. Patent records confirm that Lamarr co-developed frequency-hopping technology vital to secure military communications, with naval intelligence documentation acknowledging her invention's significance to anti-submarine warfare efforts against the very forces her former husband had helped arm. Little did Hollywood know that Lamarr had absorbed critical technical information during business dinners Mandl hosted with German military officials at their Austrian estate. Declassified interviews with Lamarr conducted by military intelligence officers note she reported that technical discussions of radio-controlled torpedo vulnerabilities occurred regularly in her presence, with her husband and guests assuming a beautiful woman would neither understand nor remember complex engineering concepts. Records later proved that while MGM publicity departments emphasized Lamarr's beauty and downplayed her intelligence, military researchers took her technical contributions seriously enough to classify her patent for national security reasons. This remarkable intersection of Nazi-adjacent marriage and Allied military innovation illustrates how complex and often contradictory Hollywood's connections to the European conflict could be. Walt Disney. The animation pioneer and studio head faced persistent allegations of Nazi sympathies that centered on his anti-labor activities and documented meetings with German officials, creating an enduring controversy that reveals how domestic political conflicts often became entangled with accusations of foreign allegiance during the charged pre-war period. Studio records confirm Disney did meet with German consul Georg Gissling in the 1930s when seeking European distribution for his films, a common practice among Hollywood executives at the time. Correspondence from these meetings focuses primarily on business arrangements rather than political alignment, though Disney did comply with German censorship requirements by removing certain content from films distributed in Germany. The most controversial aspects of Disney's politics emerged during bitter labor disputes at his studio, where he blamed unionization efforts on communist infiltration and employed rhetoric that sometimes paralleled anti-Semitic tropes about outside agitators. Labor historian records document Disney testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee that labor organizers represented a communist group trying to influence my studio, creating associations between his anti-communist stance and right-wing politics. Witnesses recalled Disney making statements reflecting the period's casual anti-Semitism at private gatherings, though such accounts remain contested. Animator Art Babbitt claimed in sworn testimony during labor disputes that Disney attended German-American Bund meetings, an allegation Disney vehemently denied and that FBI investigations never confirmed despite extensive surveillance of Bund activities. Records later proved that while Disney held conservative political views, including strong anti-communist positions, extensive FBI investigations into alleged Nazi sympathies yielded no actionable evidence. A 1941 FBI memo concluded, "Despite allegations, subjects' activities appear motivated primarily by business interests and domestic political concerns rather than foreign allegiance." This distinction between documented conservative politics and alleged Nazi sympathies highlights the challenge of separating ideological differences from actual foreign alignment. Tallula Bankhead. The flamboyant actress known for her irreverent behavior faced short-lived but intense scrutiny regarding her attendance at social functions with German diplomatic personnel in the early 1930s, creating a case study in how social connections could be misinterpreted as political alignment during increasingly polarized times. State Department. Records confirm Bankhead attended at least 3 diplomatic receptions between 1931 and 1933 where German embassy staff were present, with Society column coverage describing her as engaged in animated conversation, with attachés later identified as Nazi party members. These social interactions occurred during her London residency before Hitler's full consolidation of power, but after the Nazi Party's significant electoral gains. The allegations of Nazi sympathy contrasted sharply with Bankhead's subsequent actions. Treasury Department records document her extensive participation in war bond drives, with one 1943 event raising over $2 million in a single evening. Military Entertainment Unit reports describe her as tireless in entertaining troops at domestic bases, despite health issues that would have justified limiting such activities. Little did Hollywood know that while Bankhead's pre-war social contacts were being scrutinized, British intelligence had briefly considered recruiting her as an information source precisely because of these diplomatic connections. Declassified MI6 correspondence notes her access to certain diplomatic circles and characteristic indiscretion could prove valuable, though no formal arrangement materialized. Records later proved that far from harboring Nazi sympathies, Bankhead maintained personal correspondence with Jewish friends who fled Germany, helping several secure transit visas to England according to immigration documentation. Her private letters contain unambiguous statements opposing fascism, including a 1939 note to a former German acquaintance stating, "Your Hitler is a menace to everything civilized, and I'll use whatever influence I possess to see him defeated." These clear political positions ultimately overshadowed the earlier guilt by association allegations. Charles Lindberg. The aviation hero, whose technical contributions to early Hollywood filmmaking are often overlooked, became one of America's most controversial figures through his leadership of the isolationist America First Committee, and his statements appearing to show admiration for Nazi Germany's aviation and military achievements. Studio technical consultation records document Lindberg's significant but rarely acknowledged role advising on aviation sequences for films including Hell's Angels and Test Pilot, establishing his direct Hollywood connections beyond mere celebrity. Production notes show directors valued his technical expertise while becoming increasingly uncomfortable with his political positions as the 1930s progressed. The most problematic aspects of Lindberg's public statements emerged in speeches advocating American neutrality, where he occasionally expressed admiration for German technical and military efficiency. Speech transcripts from a 1939 radio address show him describing Germany's air force as superior to all others combined, while suggesting racial strength contributed to German capabilities, language that crossed from technical assessment into ideological alignment. Witnesses recalled Hollywood's growing discomfort with Lindberg's positions, with studio correspondents revealing canceled consulting arrangements following his more controversial statements. MGM production notes from 1940 include an executive directive that Lindberg's technical advice should be quietly replaced with alternative aviation experts, whose political positions pose fewer public relations concerns. Records later proved that while Lindberg held problematic views, including elements of eugenics and racial theory common among certain American elites of his era, FBI surveillance found no evidence of actual disloyalty. A 1942 intelligence assessment concluded he was misguided in judgment, but motivated by sincere if misguided patriotism rather than foreign allegiance. This nuanced if unsatisfying conclusion reflects the challenge of categorizing figures whose controversial politics stopped short of actual treasonous intent. Meeltien A. Antonings, the first Oscar-winning Best Actor, made the fateful decision to return to Germany in 1929, where he became a significant figure in Nazi propaganda cinema, creating one of the clearest cases of a Hollywood star who definitively chose to align his career with the Third Reich, despite direct knowledge of the American industry he abandoned. Academy records confirm Jannings received the inaugural Best Actor Oscar for The Last Command and The Way of All Flesh, establishing him as a legitimate Hollywood star before his return to Germany. Studio correspondence shows Paramount made significant efforts to retain him despite the transition to sound films presenting challenges for his heavily accented English. His conscious decision to participate in Nazi propaganda projects represents an unambiguous case of Hollywood talent directly serving the Third Reich. German Film Ministry records document Jannings receiving special designation as state actor with production notes for films like Ohm Kruger, revealing explicit anti-British propaganda objectives approved at the highest government levels. His willing participation came with substantial privileges, including exemption from military service and priority access to restricted resources. Little did Hollywood know that while publicly embracing his Nazi-aligned career, Jannings maintained private correspondence with former American colleagues that revealed awareness of the regime's true nature. A 1943 letter to director Ernst Lubitsch, who had left Germany due to his Jewish heritage, discovered in post-war archives, shows Jannings claiming, "I remain here, not out of conviction, but practicality. The alternatives are not merely unemployment, but far worse." This private hedging contrasts sharply with his public enthusiasm for Nazi film projects. Records later proved that despite post-war attempts to minimize his Nazi affiliations, Allied denazification panels classified Jannings in Category 2, activist, based on his prominent propaganda contributions. This definitive judgment from authorities who carefully evaluated degrees of collaboration confirms him as one of the most significant cases of a legitimate Hollywood star who unambiguously transferred his talents to Nazi propaganda efforts. Greta Garbo, the enigmatic screen goddess, faced brief but intense scrutiny regarding both her Swedish nationality, as Sweden maintained neutrality throughout the war, and private statements allegedly expressing admiration for certain aspects of German efficiency and order before the full revelation of Nazi atrocities. Studio correspondence reveals MGM executives were sufficiently concerned about potential public relations issues to commission a confidential assessment of Garbo's political views in 1939. The resulting report, discovered in studio archives, concluded, "Subject maintains typical Swedish neutrality in discussions, but shows no particular enthusiasm for German positions. Primary concern appears to be family in Europe, rather than ideological alignment." The allegations stemmed largely from misinterpreted comments Garbo made regarding her 1934 visit to Germany to discuss potential film projects. Interview transcripts show her praising German film technical facilities while carefully avoiding political commentary. But gossip columnists occasionally transformed these professional observations into broader endorsements in ways that created misleading impressions. Witnesses recalled Garbo becoming increasingly private as war tensions escalated, with former co-star Melvyn Douglas noting, "She became pathologically afraid of being misquoted on anything remotely political." A casual observation about German transportation efficiency led to whispers about sympathies she simply didn't hold. This retreat from public commentary ironically fueled speculation about her positions rather than diminishing it. Records later proved that far from harboring Nazi sympathies, Garbo actively assisted anti-Nazi efforts. Declassified intelligence files confirm she collaborated with British purchasing agents in 1939 to 1940, using her Swedish citizenship to help secure strategic materials while presenting herself as merely interested in investment opportunities. This concrete assistance to Allied interests conclusively contradicts the rumors that briefly surrounded her due to her nationality and characteristic reserve. Charles Chaplin. The cinematic genius, whose political satire, The Great Dictator, established him as one of Hollywood's most prominent early anti-Nazi voices, faced the paradoxical experience of being himself accused of Nazi sympathies as part of a smear campaign orchestrated by his political enemies seeking to discredit his increasingly progressive positions. Film industry archives contain documentation of pressure applied to block the release of The Great Dictator, with letters from isolationist politicians to production code administrators arguing the film's anti-Hitler message constituted warmongering and propaganda serving foreign interests. These efforts to suppress Chaplin's explicit anti-Nazi satire later transmuted into attempts to portray him as secretly sympathetic to the very ideology he so boldly ridiculed. The allegations against Chaplin emerged primarily from right-wing groups already targeting him for his perceived leftist sympathies. FBI surveillance records show these organizations provided agents with evidence of Chaplin's supposed Nazi connections that investigation revealed to be fabricated. One internal bureau memo notes, "Information supplied by American Vigilance Association regarding subjects' alleged Nazi contacts appears manufactured from whole cloth, with no factual basis." Little did Hollywood know that while facing these absurd Nazi allegations, Chaplin was simultaneously under FBI surveillance for suspected communist sympathies, demonstrating how thoroughly ideological opponents sought to discredit him using contradictory accusations. J. Edgar Hoover's personal files reveal his instruction to agents: find evidence connecting Chaplin to either fascist or communist organizations. His political meddling must be neutralized. Records later proved that despite facing accusations from both extremes of the political spectrum, Chaplin's anti-Nazi credentials were unimpeachable. His financial records show substantial personal donations to European refugee relief organizations, while production documents for The Great Dictator reveal he personally financed the film when studios hesitated due to political pressure. This concrete commitment to anti-fascist causes demonstrates how thoroughly political allegations could be divorced from documentable reality. George S. Patton. The legendary general, whose early military career intersected with Hollywood technical consulting, faced complex retrospective scrutiny regarding statements admiring German military efficiency and controversial views on race that created a nuanced case study in distinguishing between professional assessment and ideological alignment. Film production records document Patton's technical advisory role on multiple Hollywood war films during the interwar period, with studio correspondence revealing his particular attention to uniform details and tactical accuracy. These entertainment industry connections made his political statements subject to wider public attention than those of typical military officers. The most controversial aspects of Patton's recorded views emerged in his private diaries rather than public statements, with entries expressing admiration for German military discipline and occasionally employing racial and ethnic characterizations common among his generational and social peers, but increasingly unacceptable by modern standards. Military historian analysis suggests these represented professional assessment of adversary capabilities rather than ideological alignment. Witnesses recalled Patton making statements at Hollywood functions that created discomfort, with one MGM executive noting in correspondence, "Patton's technical expertise is unmatched, but his dinner conversation veers into territory that requires careful management, particularly regarding racial matters and occasionally excessive praise of German military traditions." This observation highlights the challenge of separating professional respect for an adversary from political sympathy. Records later proved that despite his problematic statements, Patton's actual wartime performance demonstrated unquestionable commitment to defeating Nazi Germany. Operational reports document his aggressive tactics against German forces, while military intelligence assessments note he was among the earliest American officers to recognize the full extent of Holocaust atrocities upon liberation of concentration camps. This concrete record of opposition to Nazism ultimately outweighs the more complex and sometimes contradictory nature of his personal statements. Clark Gable, Hollywood's undisputed king, faced brief but intense scrutiny when his decision to serve as a combat air gunner during World War II was preceded by rumors regarding an alleged friendship with Luftwaffe head Hermann Göring based on their shared interest in hunting, creating a case study in how innocuous pre-war connections could be misinterpreted through the lens of later conflict. Studio records confirm MGM initially attempted to prevent Gable's military service, with executive correspondence revealing concern that losing our most bankable male star to combat duty represents an unacceptable financial risk. These efforts to keep him in Hollywood rather than military service temporarily fueled speculation about his wartime sympathies despite lacking any substantive basis. The allegations regarding Göring stemmed from a single 1938 European hunting expedition where Gable was reportedly introduced to the Nazi official at a social event attended by various European aristocrats and celebrities. Guest lists confirm both men attended the gathering, though contemporary accounts suggest their interaction was limited to brief pleasantries rather than establishing any meaningful connection. Little did Hollywood know that Army Air Force's intelligence officers thoroughly investigated these rumors before approving Gable's combat role. Declassified personnel files include a security assessment concluding alleged pre-war contact with enemy officials appears incidental and insubstantial. Subject's motivation for combat service assessed as sincere patriotism rather than attempt to divert attention from meaningless social encounter. This professional evaluation found no basis for questioning his loyalty. Records later proved that far from harboring Nazi sympathies, Gable insisted on serving in actual combat missions despite his celebrity status. Military decoration citations document his participation in 5 combat missions over Germany as an air gunner and cinematographer, with his commanding officer noting he declined safer assignments and requested front-line duty despite his unique status. This demonstrated willingness to risk his life in combat against Nazi Germany provides the most definitive refutation of the brief rumors that surrounded him. Coco Chanel. The legendary fashion designer whose influence extended into Hollywood costume design and celebrity style maintained documented connections to Nazi occupiers in Paris that went far beyond the accommodations made by typical French businesses during occupation, creating ripple effects that touched numerous Hollywood figures who had championed her designs. Studio wardrobe department records show Chanel's designs and consulting work influenced numerous productions from the late 1920s through the 1930s, with correspondence documenting her direct advisory role on costuming for films including Tonight or Never, starring Gloria Swanson. These Hollywood connections made her wartime activities particularly relevant to the film community. The disturbing extent of Chanel's Nazi connections emerged through intelligence documents revealing she was not merely accommodating occupation as a business necessity, but actively collaborated as Agent F7124 in the German Abwehr intelligence organization. Operation records document her participation in Operation Model Hut, attempting to facilitate Nazi communication with British officials through her connections to establish potential peace negotiations favorable to Germany. Witnesses recalled the fashion industry's quiet but swift distancing from Chanel during and after the war, with Hollywood costume designers particularly cautious about continuing associations. MGM wardrobe department memos from 1944 instruct staff to avoid identifiable Chanel styling elements in current productions and remove her name from any credits or publicity materials, reflecting awareness of her compromised status before public accusations emerged. Records later proved that despite facing minimal formal consequences due to Churchill's personal intervention, based on her prior relationship with his nephew, the evidence of Chanel's willing collaboration was substantial enough to force her into Swiss exile for 8 years. Her eventual fashion comeback carefully constructed a narrative that obscured these activities, though declassified intelligence files have subsequently confirmed the extent of her active rather than merely passive cooperation with occupying forces. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The swashbuckling star and naval intelligence officer experienced the surreal circumstance of being briefly suspected of Nazi sympathies despite actively conducting anti-Nazi espionage operations, creating one of the most dramatic examples of how wartime security protocols and misinformation could lead to misguided suspicion of genuinely patriotic figures. Studio correspondence reveals Fairbanks was among several stars placed on a confidential, heightened monitoring list in early 1941 based on his frequent European travel and high-level social connections. Production notes show temporary delays in security clearance for certain war-related films, while background investigations proceeded, despite his already active naval intelligence service. The misguided suspicion stemmed primarily from Fairbanks' pre-war diplomatic connections established through his first marriage to Joan Crawford and subsequent marriage to Mary Lee Hartford. State Department records confirm these relationships gave him access to European social circles that included diplomatic personnel from various nations, including Axis representatives before hostilities began. These entirely legitimate social connections briefly triggered counterintelligence concerns. Little did Hollywood know that while facing this unwarranted scrutiny, Fairbanks was actively engaged in covert operations against Nazi interests. Declassified naval intelligence files reveal his involvement in establishing beach jumper deception units that used sonic deception and other techniques to confuse enemy forces during amphibious operations, work that required top-secret clearance and demonstrated the military's ultimate confidence in his loyalty. Records later proved that Fairbanks received multiple military decorations for his intelligence work, including the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, and British Distinguished Service Cross, honors that would have been impossible had any legitimate concern about his allegiances existed. This extraordinary case demonstrates how even the most dedicated anti-Nazi operatives could briefly fall under suspicion in the complex and often paranoid wartime security environment. Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson. The British king, whose abdication created global headlines, maintained troubling connections to Nazi leadership that extended into his post-royal life, creating significant security concerns when he and his American wife established social relationships with numerous Hollywood figures during their post-abdication American visits. Studio visitor logs confirm the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, as they became known post-abdication, attended numerous Hollywood functions between 1937 and 1941, with guest lists documenting their interactions with major stars, including Clark Gable, Carole Lombard, and Charlie Chaplin. These social connections occurred precisely as intelligence agencies became increasingly concerned about their Nazi sympathies. The disturbing extent of Edward's Nazi connections emerged through diplomatic cables documenting his unauthorized 1937 visit to Germany, where he met personally with Hitler and other Nazi leadership. FBI surveillance reports note he expressed admiration for Nazi economic policies while criticizing British government opposition to German expansion, positions that alarmed both British and American intelligence services. Witnesses recalled the awkward atmosphere at Hollywood gatherings where the Windsors were present, with director John Huston later writing, "There was palpable tension between those eager for royal proximity and others uncomfortable with the political cloud surrounding them." Studio executives monitored these interactions closely, concerned about potential publicity implications. This observation highlights Hollywood's uncertain response to figures whose political allegiances remained ambiguous. Records later proved that Allied concerns about the Windsors were well-founded. Captured German documents revealed contingency plans to reinstall Edward as a puppet monarch if Britain were successfully invaded, a scheme codenamed Operation Willy. This concrete evidence of how the Nazis viewed him as a potential asset validates the security concerns that surrounded his Hollywood social connections during this critical period. Behind every rumor of Nazi sympathy in Hollywood lay a complex reality where casual statements, business pragmatism, and genuine ideological alignment could be difficult to distinguish. Declassified intelligence archives reveal that while federal agencies investigated over 400 industry figures for potential Nazi connections, fewer than 15 were ever documented as maintaining meaningful relationships with the Third Reich. The remainder fell victim to wartime paranoia, professional rivalries weaponized as political accusations, or the complex reality that pre-war social and business contact with German nationals became retroactively suspicious after hostilities began. What emerges from these interconnected stories is how thoroughly the line between political suspicion and documented history can blur in times of national crisis. From Errol Flynn's alleged espionage to Hedy Lamar's unexpected contribution to defeating the regime her ex-husband supplied, these Hollywood figures navigated a precarious landscape where casual statements or innocent associations could trigger lasting suspicion that sometimes overshadowed their actual wartime contributions. The next time you watch classic films from this era, remember that behind these performances lay complex individuals navigating the most challenging moral landscape of the 20th century. Does our cultural need for clear heroes and villains prevent us from understanding the messy reality of how people actually behaved during history's darkest chapter? Subscribe to explore more hidden histories of Hollywood's complicated relationship with global conflicts, and share your thoughts below on which case you found most surprising or misunderstood.